So, one of the problems that a historian of disability encounters when engaging upon disability history is that disability means various things to various people, and it's a very broad category. So, we can think about intellectual disability in the past, we can think about physical disability in the past. I'm going to be speaking about an example of somebody who had ambulatory needs, requirements. So I'm talking about physical disability in the past. When we think about the 18th century, we have to be very careful not to transpose what we know about disability today onto the 18th century. The 18th century, like any period, has its own ideas about the disabled body, about disabled embodiment. There is a very kind of rich and interesting and problematic terrain to traverse when it comes to language about disability in the past. We may start with a example from Samuel Johnson, that heavyweight of 18th century letters. We may start with an example from his dictionary, published in 1755. And if we look up the word disability in Johnson's dictionary, we get a definition that goes as follows: want of power to do anything, weakness, impotence. So this sense of disability that we get here is about want of power, weakness, or impotence. It's very clearly linked to physicality. So disability in this definition is about physical disability, physical impotence, a want of power. But what does that mean? How does that align with our current understanding of disability? Well, it doesn't really. It aligns in so much as here Johnson is talking about a want of power to do anything. There's something impaired going on. There's something there that is clearly connected to physicality, but that's where the definition stops. Scholars of the 18th century who work on disability, like David M. Turner, they really face the problem of writing disability history before disability existed in its modern sense. So to be disabled today, to inhabit that identity, it really means that you have a physical impairment, an intellectual impairment, but you also are disabled, and therefore you have certain rights and entitlements to accommodations. There is a sense that some people who are disabled don't want to identify as disabled. Some do. Disability identity is incredibly complex in our own time, let alone thinking about it in the past. And what scholars like David M. Turner point to in their book Disability in 18th Century England, Imagining Physical Impairment, which was published in 2012, they point to this problem of writing about disability before disability in its modern sense has emerged, has taken shape. So there's a sense of the 18th century being an incredibly sort of complex terrain upon which to talk about a disabled subject. What does that mean? We've already seen that the dictionary definition in Samuel Johnson's weighty tome, his dictionary, that doesn't really help us to understand fully what disability might mean in that period. The language of the period when it comes to disability is quite interesting. So in the 18th century, the term disabled, as we've seen in Johnson's dictionary definition, is about a want of power or impotence. And it's very closely connected in this period to fitness for military or naval service. So the word disabled, if we see it used in the 18th century, it's often used about a soldier who has a want of power, who has been disabled in service. And that kind of category of the disabled is very much connected to military service, to naval or military service. So that's really what disabled means in the 18th century. There is another word that's used, which is connected to disability, and that is deformity. Deformity as a word is a word that tracks many kinds of physical and intellectual disabilities that we would recognize today. It's a hurtful word. This is an issue when we are looking at disability in the past. We are going to encounter words that are hurtful, that are difficult to process in relation to disabled people we know and we care about. We may be disabled ourselves. We are going to encounter words like deformity. In an 18th century context, deformity signals disability in lots of ways. Another word that is connected to disability at this time is the word sin. So there are different ways of thinking about disability throughout history. There is the charity model, the medical model, and the social model. And in the 18th century, the charity model is really the model that is used when we're thinking about, or when people in the 18th century were thinking about disability. And in the charity model, which goes way back to the medieval period, the person who is disabled, and the cure for that disability is seen as prayer or the giving of alms. So somebody who presents with a physical or ambulatory disability, the kind of the response to that is prayer or the giving of alms, the giving of charity, the charity model. Now, within that model, disability is seen as a sin. So it is a punishment. It is a punishment for that person's sin, or the sin that their family have apparently committed. This is a very problematic way of thinking about disability, but it is, in a historical sense, the way that disability was thought about. And it would be a mistake, actually, to think that this model has just evaporated over time. There are still people who think of disabled people and disability in this framework of the charity model. We then have the medical model, which does start to emerge in the 18th century, which sees disability as a dysfunction in biomedicine. So the disability is something that has happened to the person. It's a flaw, something that is wrong with them. And the cure is not prayer or alms, as it is in the charity model. It is medical intervention. It is the apothecary. It is the medic. It is the job of medicine to solve or cure that disability. And this is a model that begins in the 18th century, but really takes shape and hold in the 19th century as medicine as a profession starts to emerge, as medicine becomes professionalized. We then have in the 20th century, from the mid-20th century onwards, Mike Oliver's social model. And this model, known as the social model, which was developed by Mike Oliver, really sees the environment as the disabling factor. So it's not the person with a disability who is disabled, it's the environment that disables them. So the example is a person in a wheelchair can access a building if there is an accommodation there, if there is a ramp, if the environment is made accessible. Therefore, the access issue is the question in the social model. It's the social environment that is disabling, not the person who has a particular need. That is not a model that exists in the 18th century. We have the charity model, this idea of disability being a sin that needs prayer and alms, and we have the beginnings of the medical model, this sense that disability is a dysfunction in biomedicine, something that is inherent that can be cured through medicine. And it's the clinic, it's the apothecary, it's the doctor who has the responsibility for doing that. So we're not quite at the point of the social model in the 18th century. That comes much later. We have charity and we have the medical model starting to kind of interact. Now, if we go back to Samuel Johnson's dictionary and look up the word deformity, we can start to tease out an 18th century kind of language around disability. So deformity in Johnson's dictionary, as we can see here, is described as ugliness or ill-favouredness. Ill-favouredness connects in some way to the charity model, this idea that to be disabled is a punishment, is a punishment for sin. So ill-favouredness kind of gently touches upon that idea of the disabled person being punished, ill-favoured. Ugliness is talking about physical disability or the presentation of that. And then if we look at the second part of Johnson's definition of deformity, he talks about ridiculousness, the quality of something worthy to be laughed at, the quality of something worthy to be laughed at. So what we have encoded then in this definition of deformity is a nod to disability being connected to sin and that charity model that I spoke about, but also this sense of the disabled person being a figure of ridicule, and that the quality of, their representation, their sort of physical embodiment, that very quality has something worthy to be laughed at, which is a very hurtful articulation, but I think speaks a lot about the ways in which 18th century culture and society saw disability. In the 18th century, we have a kind of rise in print culture. We have more people reading. We have print matter being cheaper. We have a kind of preoccupation with new kind of forms like the essay. And the essay as a literary form becomes a sort of privileged space where authors begin to talk about themselves in interesting ways that haven't really been captured before. And one of those authors is William Hay, who was born in Glyndebourne, Sussex in 1695. He's orphaned quite early on, 1700. He attends grammar school. He studies law, matriculates at Christ Church, Oxford. He contracts smallpox in 1715, and he sort of suffers with that till 1718. And this actually creates a kind of an issue with his vision. He becomes visually impaired. He has curvature of the spine, so he's quite kind of short in stature, and this marks him out as kind of having a kind of deformed body, what we would describe nowadays as kind of disabled embodiment. At the time, he's marked out in terms of the 18th century's preoccupation with deformity. He marries Elizabeth Phelim. He's elected as an MP in 1734, and he publishes an essay known as Deformity, an Essay, in 1754, which goes through a series of editions before he dies in 1755. And in this essay, he takes deformity as his topic. In other words, we may say he takes disability as his topic, if we were to put it into a 21st century parlance, because we know that that word deformity in an 18th century context is speaking to experiences that we would now describe as the experiences of people with impairments or disabilities. So William Hay's essay, Deformity, has a kind of unique place in terms of disability history and the history of disability in 18th century Britain. It is the first essay in the 18th century that takes disability as its subject and is also written from the perspective of somebody who is disabled. So William Hay, as an author, has this unique experience, and he uses the essay form to communicate that experience. So there have been essays before William Hay's Deformity and Essay that have taken deformity and disability as a subject to explore, but Hay is the first person who is disabled to write from that experience and to actually use that experience as a positive, as a kind of, as a way of opening up the kind of the question of experience and deformity. So this is incredibly interesting from a kind of history of disability perspective, an 18th century perspective, but also the history of the essay as well. In the opening of his essay, Hay says that it is offensive for a man to speak much of himself, and few can do it with so good a grace as Montaigne. Now he's talking about Montaigne, he's talking about a series of essays by Montaigne that most learned people will have an awareness of. If they haven't read the essays, they will know kind of snippets or quotes from Montaigne. So he's pointing here to a kind of history of the essay. He's saying, you know, it's offensive for people to speak about themselves, but actually if they're going to speak about themselves, they'll do it in the essay form. And I know Montaigne, who has written these essays. So there's a kind of setup here. He says, I wish I could, or that I could be half so entertaining or instructive. My subject, however, will be my apology, and I'm sure it will draw no envy upon me. Bodily deformity is visible to every eye, but the effects of it are known to very few. Intimately known to none but those who feel them, and they generally are not inclined to reveal them. So Hay here is talking from a place of lived experience, and he is announcing at the start of Deformity and Essay that he will be writing from this place of lived experience. And this is quite new. The essay is beginning at this time in the 18th century to be a literary form that is introducing readers to an inner world, this sense of interiority that a reader can tap into, this sense of the author having an interiority. But here Hay is really using that to introduce the reader to the lived experience of the deformed person, an experience that we certainly do not get in dictionary definitions like Johnson's, which talk about the quality of deformity being something that is worthy of ridicule. So here we're getting a very different entry point into this question of deformity. He says that physical deformity, bodily deformity, is visible to every eye, but the effects of it are known to very few. Intimately known to none but those who feel them, and they generally are not inclined to reveal them. So in this early opening of the essay, we're getting this sense that what Hay is about to reveal here is something that generally people do not know, people do not have access to. So the false modesty at the start that he says about, not being as entertaining as Montaigne and so on, it is false. Because really what he's saying here is, I'm going to tell you something that is going to change how you think about deformity, and to put it into 21st century parlance, how you think about disabled people. So in the beginning of this essay then, we get this sense that the essay form is going to reveal an interiority that is unique to the deformed subject, the person with deformity in the 18th century. It's intimately known to none but those who feel them, and they generally are not inclined to reveal them. Now, William Hay talks about his own deformed physicality as not being productive of envy, that this is not a position that people are going to want to emulate or to be. There is a sense that this is a position that has left him at a disadvantage. And he talks kind of very early on about the dangers of being physically different in an 18th century public space. There's a lot about mental health in his depiction of his physical difference in his essay on deformity. And although it's not really described in this way, we can read into his depiction of his very existence in the 18th century in public space. We can read into that a kind of very anxious account. So there's lots here about anxiety and about the ways in which people's reaction to him creates anxiety. So he writes about kind of how he navigates through London, through different sort of public spaces. He says, when by some uncommon accident I have been drawn into a country fair, a cockpit, bear garden, to the like riotous assemblies, after I have got from them, I have felt the pleasure of one escaped from the danger of a wreck. So he's talking here about a country fair, so you can imagine like a marketplace. He's talking about cockfighting. He's talking about what he describes as riotous assemblies. And he's talking about his own kind of situatedness in those public places. And he feels in danger. He is of a smaller stature. He has difficulty in terms of his movement because of the curvature of his spine. And he feels in danger navigating those places. He talks about when he is in private, when he is alone, having left the outside world, closing the door behind him, that he feels a pleasure as if he has escaped from the danger of a wreck. He says, for all the time I am present, I consider myself as liable to affront without a power of showing any resentment, which would expose me to tenfold ridicule. Again, back to this idea of ridicule. His deformity is a basis for ridicule in the 18th century. And that kind of sense of, him being worthy of ridicule, that's dictionary definition. That's what Johnson says about deformity. And he is here reproducing that attitude by saying, that he is, if he shows any resentment to the way people engage with him, it would expose him to tenfold ridicule. So he would be even more exposed to people's laughter and ridicule. He goes on to say, nor am I formed for a masquerade where such a figure would soon be discovered. Now, the masquerade is a ball that is part of polite society. It also is a ball where people from different classes can attend depending on the actual event. And it is a masquerade. People dress up, they disguise themselves. And here, Hay is saying he can't disguise himself because his body is so misshapen that any disguise would reveal his shape and reveal who he was. So there's a sense here that he is, unable to participate in the kind of public events and the sort of social gatherings of a man of his class at this time in the 18th century. Nor am I formed for the masquerade, where such a figure would soon be discovered, nor escape abuse from the lower class, whom the mask introduces to their betters. So he's talking here about lower class people attending some masquerades and that they would abuse him. So The way that Hay talks about class is very interesting. He seems to be very wedded to the upper class, and he presents the upper class as being more favourably disposed to deformity, to men like him, to kind of welcoming men like him into their company. And he kind of presents the lower class as a sort of rabble, as a mob who would abuse him, would affront him. We have to be suspicious of that kind of framing. He is writing for a particular audience, and I have no doubt that members of the upper class also ridiculed him or ridiculed people with deformities. But it makes sense for Hay to want to ingratiate himself and his words into a kind of a favourable position, to ingratiate himself into a favourable position with members of the upper class. So there's a kind of snobbery that attends Hay's representations, which are, is quite interesting. But he talks about the lower class as, being able to disguise themselves at masquerades, introduced to their betters, and where all indulge a greater liberty of behaviour. So there's a sense of the masquerade as a kind of carnivalesque time of permission, of possibility. And here Hay is saying that his bodily deformity marks him out even in that kind of realm of freedom and permissiveness that the masquerade is meant to represent. So there's a sense of him being completely at a disadvantage, of being at risk in public. There's a sense of his mental health being damaged by being in public, and a sense of kind of needing to get relief, to retreat, to leave the public world behind, because his body marks him out as being so different, maybe too different to exist safely in public. He also talks about men coming along and kind of leaning on him, using him as a sort of a leaning post or something to lean on. So he really talks about ways in which in public he is maligned and kind of disrespected. His body does not command respect. Now, I spoke a little bit about the ways in which Hay, in his essay, talks down to the lower classes. Certainly, there's issues with the way in which Hay talks about women in his essay. If you read it, you will see that. There's also this sense that Hay is anti clubs like the Ugly Club. Now, the Ugly Club, again, ugly meaning deformity. We could talk about the Ugly Club as being a club for people who are disabled or varying abled or impaired. The Ugly Club is a real club. There is a Ugly Club in the 18th century in Liverpool. But what Hay is probably talking about here is the depiction of the Ugly Club in The Spectator, which is written by Joseph Addison and Richard Steele. And it's presented as a club in Oxford for men with ugly faces, essentially. And it is a University of Oxford club. There is a letter in The Spectator that depicts this club. And really what The Spectator is doing in presenting this ugly club is kind of satiating people's desires to know more about how people are associating. There's a sense of, the ridiculous, that this is a kind of point of ridicule, that men are arranging themselves or joining this club because they're ugly. There's a kind of depiction of, of these men in The Spectator. There's also an ugly club in Ned Ward's Secret History of Clubs, which again is talking about a kind of a curiosity is being satiated there in terms of associational culture. Now, what Hay is doing here in talking about the Ugly Club is he's kind of saying that it shouldn't exist. He's saying, I never was nor never will be a member of the Ugly Club, and I would advise those gentlemen to meet no more, for though they may be a very ingenious and facetious society, yet it draws the eyes of the world too much upon them, and theirs too much from the world. For who would choose to be always looking at bad pictures when there is so great a collection to be met with of good ones, especially among the fair sex, who, if they will not admit them to be intimacies, will permit them to be distant admirers. When deformed persons appear together, it doubles the ridicule because of the similitude, and it does when they are seen with very large persons because of the contrast. So this is incredibly interesting. Here we have Hay writing an essay that foregrounds lived experience of deformity, but at the same time arguing against any kind of assembly of deformed men. Deformed people, disabled people should not assemble together, should not draw the eye towards them. There is a sense here of a lack of solidarity, actually, with other disabled, what we would call disabled people at the time. So there's kind of really conflicting messages going on, really interesting messages going on in Hay's essay. On the one hand, it's an essay that is, foregrounding lived experience, Hay's lived experience of being, having curvature of the spine, being of a short stature. He doesn't talk about blindness, but he is actually also visually impaired. So there's lots going on in that kind of way in which the essay is foregrounding that experience. But then even within the essay, he's saying ugly clubs should not exist. Therefore, people who have disabilities or have, differences should not assemble in these ways. So there's something really interesting going on with the kind of limitations of a kind of representation of lived experience that is very bound to the 18th century. So here Hay is very kind of much speaking from a particular class position, a particular gendered position. And that class and gendered position doesn't outweigh, that gender and class position outweighs any kind of solidarity that he may have for other people who are classed as deformed. Masculinity is a huge topic in Hay's essay. The way in which he talks about the lived experience of somebody with a curvature of the spine, someone of his stature, is absolutely connected also to the ideals of the 18th century gentleman. So Hay is very much talking about his own experience and the ways in which that experience does and does not align to the protocols of masculinity that he has internalized, as all men of his class have internalized in the 18th century. We can see in a particular moment of his essay this idea of masculinity coming into tension with deformity or disability. He notes, "For I can bend my body no farther than it is bent by nature. For this reason, when ladies drop a fan or a glove, I'm not the first to take them up, and often restrain my inclination to perform those little services rather than expose my spider-like shape." He also talks about not being able to stand up when company enters a room. So there are these kind of moments of what Hay describes as shortcomings in his own ability to perform the social niceties that are expected of men, the picking up of a fan or a glove that a woman may drop. He feels he has to restrain his inclination to perform that service because it may expose the shape of his body, which then in turn may lead to ridicule. So there is this sense that Hay is very aware that his own unique physicality, which is perceived as deformity in this period, is really in tension with his sense of himself as a man, his sense of himself as a gentleman, which is bound to class, and the kind of compulsion that he feels to perform masculinity. And this is a particular point of the essay that he's inviting readers to think about. It could be that he is trying to demonstrate that he is even more manly because he is saving women in that instance, from the awkwardness of him kind of appearing as a spider-like shape. He's trying to reclaim, I think, in this part of the essay, some sense of his own masculinity. And again, we can see that disability or deformity for Hay is much more than a physical state. It has cultural meanings, and he wants readers to know about these cultural meanings and the impact that deformity has on his own sense of gendered self. Something that's really interesting about the essay that Hay writes is that it starts with many examples of deformity as a disadvantage. And we've spoken or thought about some of that already in terms of the way in which Hay navigates public space, the anxiety that that kind of navigation produces, the effect that it has on his mental health. There's also the example of masculinity and the ways in which his physicality does not allow him to perform some of the cultural trappings that are associated with gentlemanly behaviour in that particular period. The picking up of a glove or a fan that a woman has dropped, for example, the standing up when somebody comes into a room. These are all things that Hay, writes about and kind of bemoans. Really, is quite upset and troubled by his inability to perform masculinity or to exist in space in a kind of autonomous, independent and safe way. However, there is a turn in the essay towards the end, a kind of turn in tone, a shift that makes disability or deformity seem like a positive thing in and of itself. And this is really a very interesting, powerful move by Hay. He starts to talk about deformity and health, and particularly men's health. And he says, on the whole, I conclude that deformity is a protection to a man's health and person, which, strange as it may appear, are better defended by feebleness than strength. In this kind of moment in the essay, what Hay is putting forward is this idea that, yes, he may find it difficult to navigate public space. Yes, he may not be able to perform the social niceties and rituals attached to gentlemanliness in a full way. But actually, his feebleness, what he calls his feebleness, is better for his health than his strength or lack of strength. So he's saying that because his own physicality is deformed, because of that very deformity, he has had to take protections and he has had to live in a certain way. That means that those protections and that lifestyle make him healthier overall. He's not going to be engaging in duels. He's not going to be challenging other men to a duel. He's not going to be in an environment where it may be riotous and he may be physically injured. He also talks about, a kind of health regime, the sort of things that he eats, abstaining from food, from alcohol. He has found a way to be healthy, but also to promote a kind of healthiness that is based on his lived experience of deformity. This is huge. This is a huge claim for him to make in this essay. An essay that begins describing the negatives of deformity, an essay that begins describing the negatives of deformity, and actually ends by promoting the lived experience of the deformed person as a form of health advice. This is incredibly modern. This is incredibly bold in some ways of Hay to say, yes, I am deformed. You think that being deformed is a basis for ridicule, for maligning me. Well, actually, deformity has taught me things that can be used to better your health. So suddenly, at the end of the essay, deformity, this lived experience that the essay form as a genre is kind of showcasing for the reader, Hay is using that form, using the essay form, to tell the reader, you can learn from me. Actually, my lived experience of being deformed in the 18th century is a resource. It is valuable. Deformed people have knowledge, have experience that is valuable. A big part of this value for Hay in the deformed experience or the disabled experience, the physically different experience, a big part of this value is to do with the mind. So there's a shift towards the end of Hay's essay where he's talking about, health advice, where he talks about his mind as opposed to his body. He ends the essay with health advice and he moves from this kind of abject body, this body that is frightened to be in crowds, that is at risk, that is anxious, that is unable to perform certain cultural codes of masculinity. He shifts from that to talk about the mind that he has as a deformed man, as a disabled man. I'm using those two terms interchangeably here for the sake of clarity. The experience that he has led him to perfect his mind. So there is this sense of the deformed person as not just being a body, but being a body-mind. And that actually is an idea that is very central to disability studies, contemporary disability studies. To not just think of the body as a body, but to think of the body as interacting with the mind, the body-mind. And we get this articulation, this 18th century articulation from Hay of his experience as not being just bound to the body, but also being bound to the mind. So he's saying, yes, judge me as deformed, but also I am a man who's written this essay, and this is a, in some ways, beautiful essay. It's the form of the essay is in some ways polished and beautiful. It has come from a mind that is, in some ways, that is more advanced, that is scholarly, that is superior. So there is a sense here that Hay is saying deformity for him has led him to perfect his mind, that he is of a superior intellect because of his physical difference. So again, his physical deformity is in some ways for him a resource for him to better his intellect. And he's saying at the end of the essay, I've written this essay, I've shown you that I can think at this level. The disabled person, the deformed person is not just a body, And his essay harnesses the literary form of the essay to recenter how deformity is considered by readers. Readers at the end of this essay can no longer look at a deformed person or representation of a deformed person, a caricature, and not see the mind that is also there, the body mind that Hay is putting forward in Deformity, an essay. In a really interesting move as well, Hay talks about a frontispiece, that usually essays like this would come with a frontispiece, an engraving, a picture of the author. And in the essay, Deformity, he does not provide this picture. It's not published with a picture. And he makes a point of this. And essentially he says, in not so many words, the picture isn't there because you would ridicule the picture. Going back to Johnson's dictionary definition of deformity as, worthy of ridicule. Instead of the picture, he has written this essay. So you don't get a picture of Hay, you get his words. And his words describe his body, but they also describe him as a fuller person, as a person with an intellect, a body mind. So he is not just reducible to an image. He's not just reducible to an image of deformity that can be ridiculed. His essay has ensured that that's not possible. And this is a kind of mode of resistance that he is in some way offering to others who may be disabled. There may be a point where others who are deformed can read this essay, identify with it, and also realize that they are more than the stereotype, the caricature, the ways in which the culture they inhabit satirizes deformity. That is one part of their story, but it is not everything. Because Hay has successfully, in this essay, begun with that terrain and then moved on to it to talk of himself as a body mind, as being more than his body, but also to talk about the ways in which his deformed embodiment is a resource. What he has learnt about the body, what he has learnt about frailty, what he has learnt about being a precarious subject. These are all kind of realizations through experience that can help everybody, can help people be healthier, be safer. So there's a sense then of the deformed body as being a resource, as being not just something to ridicule, but something to learn from. And that's incredibly important.